Welcome back. You're still with Newsroom. Time for us now to shift our focus a little bit further north here on the continent. Now, groundbreaking new research on Boko Haram has recently been released, and it was conducted by the Citizen Research Center. Now, it's the first time researchers have managed to speak directly to ex-Boko Haram fighters in any number. The paper was released to the United Nations. The Citizen Research Center is an organization dedicated to investigating our societies. Now, for more on this specific research, we are joined from our Cape Town studio by the Managing Director of the Citizen Research Center, Stuart Jone. Very good morning to you, Stuart. Thanks for being with us.
Good morning, Eben. Thank you.
Tell us about, before we talk about you, tell us a little bit about the research that you've done with regards to Boko Haram. What are the things that kind of stood out, or the things that we should take note of?
Well, just to give you an idea of the scope of the study, it wasn't just with Boko Haram members. It did eventually culminate in that. But we spoke to 1,600 citizens in Nigeria across 5 different cities. We also spoke to 60 peace builders, as we called them, which were the heads of NGOs that were working towards peace in Nigeria. So they were the counter-narrative to Boko Haram. And then we managed to gain access to internally displaced persons camps in which we were able to speak directly to ex-Boko Haram fighters. And we spoke to 10 of them in depth, and then 120 of them on a quantitative basis, where we administered a questionnaire to them. When it comes to the findings, the main finding, and probably the most disturbing one, when we asked people why they had joined Boko Haram, is that 57% of them said that they joined Boko Haram to get revenge against the Nigerian military. And that was a particularly disturbing finding.
Interesting what's come out with regards to the role of women within this organization as well. It wasn't quite what was expected, was it?
Yeah, the traditional view of women in Boko Haram, and we've seen this with Al-Shabaab in Somalia as well, because we do a lot of work around the continent with these kinds of organizations, is that people assume that women play a fairly subservient role within the organizations, basically as wives, euphemistically speaking, or as cooks and support. But what we found here, and at least half our sample was women that we spoke to, was that they were foot soldiers. About 40% of them, I think, were foot soldiers. They were working intelligence, about 20% of them in intelligence, and about 12% of them were working in recruiting. So this has the effect of starting to reevaluate the way that we look at how Boko Haram recruits, and also at how women are being used, if you like, within Boko Haram.
You looked at that recruitment also as part of the study. What were some of the other things that stood out with regards to how people, or how recruitment is done, for that matter?
Yeah, it was really interesting. You know, I think a few assumptions were undermined or shattered, if you like, with the study, given that it was the first time that people had been able to speak directly to Boko Haram members. As far as recruitment goes, the traditional wisdom holds that it happens in mosques, it happens in madrasas, that they're firebrand imams, as we call them, that spread the message and that recruit people. But what we found that it was a far more intimate experience. At least 60% of people that had been recruited into Boko Haram were recruited in their or other people's homes. They were recruited by close friends. They were recruited by family members. They were recruited sometimes by village elders. And so there was very little evidence of firebrand imams and mosque and madrasa recruitment. While mosques were gathering places sometimes in which recruitment did happen, it wasn't happening via the imams in the mosques.
Now, the research you've done happened some months after President Muhammadu Buhari was elected. Have you got any findings around that?
Yeah, it happened, I think, about 3 months after he was elected. It was towards the end of last year that we managed to gain access to these camps. Bear in mind that the people that we spoke to were very much ex-Boko Haram fighters. By virtue of being in these internally displaced persons camps, they're effectively internal refugee camps within the northeast of Nigeria. They had to renounce Boko Haram, and they were going through a rehabilitation process. But of course, what they were speaking about was their experiences in Boko Haram over the previous years. 48% of them had actually voted in the presidential elections, which we found really surprising. And we certainly got the feeling that more might have voted if they hadn't either been with Boko Haram at the time or if they had had the means to vote. And then around 60%, or we would call it a 60% approval rating of President Buhari was evident even amongst Boko Haram members. But trust in all other levels of government was really, really low. And I mean all levels of government, right from municipality level all the way up to national government was really low. So they had invested their hopes in one person. The implication of this was that Boko Haram members themselves, or rather ex-Boko Haram members themselves, were also keen on seeing Boko Haram eradicated.
So, Stuart, from where I'm standing now, if I'm consuming this, the previous picture we had, it was a picture of this insurgency group on the fringes of society, but your research really points out to a group that is much more part of Nigerian society and very much built into the fabric of that society. Is that more accurate then?
I think that's well put, yes. It's hard to say how integrated they are into Nigerian society. We're, of course, talking about the north of Nigeria and particularly the northeast of Nigeria. I think what we found that was particularly interesting was that the levels of trauma that are experienced by people there are extraordinary, unimaginable, on both sides of the fence. When we spoke to peace builders, people that had started or worked in NGOs towards peace, they had also experienced trauma. Almost all of them had experienced severe trauma during their lives, and they had made a decision to go to the one end of the spectrum, which was to work towards peace. Boko Haram members, who had also experienced extreme trauma, had gone to the other extreme. And somewhere in that path, there were generally key figures that played a role. So peace builders became peace builders because they met someone inspirational that moved them towards peace, whereas Boko Haram members met someone in Boko Haram that moved them towards Boko Haram. And so they're two sides of the same coin. And ultimately, what Boko Haram does is attempt to undermine, and does it very successfully, undermines the identity of African communities in northeast Nigeria, also in neighboring countries like Chad and Niger. By attacking those villages, it undermines the identity of the people that live there. Boko Haram itself has an identity, and when an identity void takes place, people tend to move their identity into another organization, and so outside of their community and into Boko Haram. And that really is how Boko Haram becomes embedded in the fabric of northeastern Nigerian society.
Now, your research comes with some key policy recommendations going forward. What came out of that?
Policy recommendations are always difficult. They seem simple, but they're incredibly difficult to implement. The main policy recommendations probably revolved around that concept of community identity. This is a lesson, I think, for us in South Africa as well, and probably for politicians around the world. We did regression analysis on the citizen surveys that we did, and we also spoke to the Boko Haram people about this. And it very clearly showed that the most important structures are small. They are the micro, not the macro. They are at community level. The most important structures are strong local government, a strong sense of community, and that all of that builds resilience to recruitment from Boko Haram. And so if we want to build communities up, we need to make sure that there's strong local government from a municipality level upwards, that communities are developed and built. We also looked at the reintegration of Boko Haram members, which is quite a contentious issue, but we do hold that one of the most effective bulwarks against Boko Haram is actually reintegrating ex-Boko Haram members into their communities, because a lot of them were very, very disillusioned with what they had experienced in Boko Haram, and they actually become advocates against Boko Haram themselves within their communities. Other findings were that religious leaders are extremely important in the debate. They're trusted a lot by both sides, and so this means working with key religious leaders in the north of Nigeria is really important. And I think that was about it. If I can just check my notes. Oh, yes, military action. Well, we had found, let's not forget about that. So we had found, if we go back to the beginning of this interview, 57% of Boko Haram members joining Boko Haram because of some kind of trauma associated with the Nigerian military, whether that was their families being attacked, or whether it was they were on the fringes of Boko Haram already, and some of their friends had been attacked, and they had then joined. But that was a very worrying finding, and so one of the key recommendations also is that the rules of engagement are drawn up very carefully, and particularly when it comes to non-combatants, that they are handled really well.
Stuart, thank you very much for joining us today, my friend. Fantastic research, and it really helps us in the news business to kind of get the head around this entity that's a constant almost with us. I thank you for joining us.
Great pleasure. Thank you, Evan.
Stuart Jone, he's the Managing Director of the Citizen Research Centre. He came to us live from Cape Town.